Welcome to Vendée Radio. Today I am joined once again by the redoubtable Dr. Jesse Russell. I think by my calculations this appearance, Dr. Russell, will make you the most recurrent guest on Vendée Radio, so I am indebted to you for that. And I wanted to discuss with you tonight the phenomenon of the traditional Catholic media, to conduct a survey of the traditional stroke conservative Catholic media landscape. You are one of the world's foremost scholars on the phenomenon of Catholic neoconservatism. And I think an examination of the historical record on Catholic neoconservatism can offer us some insight into how to avoid future infiltration and manipulation of Orthodox Catholics, and a lens of analysis we can apply today. Catholic media recently has had this atmosphere of feeling quite deflated following Joe Biden's inauguration and the end of Trump's term. And this is in stark contrast to the almost frenzied support and advocacy of President Trump amongst large parts of the traditional Catholic media. So, Dr. Jesse Russell, how would you like to begin this examination?
Well, I've given several interviews where I've had my notes all over the place, and usually they go okay. So tonight, I don't know if they will or not, but obviously the best interviews are chock full of information. So I'd like to start a little bit, though, in the 19th century, and to start kind of with some principles that I think will kind of trigger some people. I think that a lot of your viewers may disagree with some of the suggestions I have, which is perfectly fine. The first principle I'd like to suggest is that there's not just one deep state. There's not just one collective of people, that it's multipolar. Now, is there like a room that if we kick down the door and there's like these billionaires in there, or the Rothschilds, or the people behind the Rothschilds, or whatever? It's possible. Like that, I forget, they were called the Gray Men or something in X-Files. There's that room with all those guys, Americans and Europeans, talking, and the smoking man comes and meets with them. It's possible, but I'd like to suggest a couple things that your listeners may disagree with, and I may be wrong about them. But that there is a right wing of the deep state. Now, many people would be okay with that. They would think, well, Jesse, that's the neocons. That's the fake right. Like the real based and hard right is fascist and monarchist, and they're fighting heroically for Western civilization. But I'd like to suggest that there are other researchers, again, I don't agree with them necessarily. I know, and I would argue too, as others have, scholars, some on the right, some on the left, that there is a sort of right wing of the deep state that is both monarchist and Masonic, that it is reactionary as well as Gnostic or theosophical, and that it has many different branches, and some of those branches are fascism and different sort of right-wing or fascist organizations. Other ones are monarchist organizations, and that these groups, as many people know, were allied during the Cold War. Some people don't know, though, they were allied under the aegis of what was called the World, I think it's the World Anti-Communist League. And that was a broad spectrum of the right, including people who were sympathetic to monarchy, people who were fascist, and that there is an alliance with this group between this group, the World Anti-Communist League, and again, this may trigger some viewers or listeners, but with the Mooney cult, the cult of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and that the Moonies and their influence can be found in various Catholic traditionalist movements. Now, this is before Trump. This is before the more recent turn in Catholic media. And so these same groups that are influenced by the Moonies, some of them also have their roots in these 19th century sort of right-wing monarchist Gnostic theosophical groups in France, like the French Gnostic Church, and these groups later on splinter and become different things like Scientology or the Golden Dawn, that sort of thing, that these groups who advocate things like the Sacred Heart of Jesus, devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, advocate the traditional Mass, advocate monarchy and that sort of thing, nonetheless are poisoned by being mixed together with occultism. And to give a parallel example of this, we have things like voodoo and Santeria, which have images of the Sacred Heart, images of Padre Pio, images of Our Lady, but also these other sort of occultic element as well. So I'd like to first argue that these movements have an influence in pre-21st century, pre-Trump traditional conservatism. I'm not saying every traditionalist group was taken over by these groups. I think it's more complex than that. I'm not saying that every monarchist or something like that, or even most, are allied with these groups. But what happened was, what is the course of the 20th century, these groups changed, they mutated, they went in different directions, and there was an alliance formed between many of these groups and Zionists. We have the birth of the sort of Judeo-Christian idea. So you'll have people literally, and people know that Mossad was trained by former German National Socialists. I know that's going to blow people's minds or whatever, but there is a strange alliance between Zionism and the far right or European or Western far right. And so there is an alliance with Zionism, and then out of that, the Trump movement comes. And just sort of generally speaking, I would say the Trump movement is an effort by the newly rebranded, mutated, more liberalized, more Zionist, hard right of the deep state to try to regain power. They did in 2016, but, and we're seeing this right now, like, by the hour, the neocons and the neoliberals have joined together in the Democratic Party, and the sort of like most powerful edge of the deep state with which the military industrial complex is allied, barring a few retired generals, and I think you're going to bring them up yourself, that there is a sort of cadre of retired military in the United States, especially, who are part of the far right or Trumpian deep state. But that basically we saw a war, a temporary, emergence of this far right deep state, and then it was crushed in 2020. I could be wrong. Some people suggest that what happened was there was a sort of like, it's all orchestrated, it's all a stage, and Trump was put in by the sort of establishment as just a puppet or whatever. That's possible, but I do think it was a genuine attempt at a coup that succeeded and then failed.
That's really interesting, and while listeners may think elements of that are far-fetched, I would point to something like QAnon, which clearly has, I'm not too familiar with the actual original postings and so on, but from what I've seen, it clearly has Gnostic undertones, and it clearly seems to almost hypnotize its adherents. And when you see Steve Bannon, when you hear him talking about a great awakening, that's quite disturbing. What is also disturbing is to see some of those sort of lines, those talking points from Steve Bannon's War Room, for example, end up on traditional Catholic media in some way. And I recall that you spoke to Tim Kelly about how landing on traditional Catholic websites increasingly resembles landing on the Breitbart website, the kind of glossiness and similar talking points.
Yes, I think to your first point, for sure that these terms like red pill, and I've used that term myself, that term is a Gnostic term, this idea of having this secret knowledge, to be awake, to be woke, or whatever, to what's going on, and blue-pilled people are asleep. I mean, that's no different than like the 18th century idea of being part of the Illuminati or the Enlightened or something like that. So I think Gnosticism, it's an overused term, but we have to remember that, in the Church's history, there are movements like the Albigensians, like Manichaeans, like you have like in the French royal family, like some of the lines are people who were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause and sympathetic to Masonry. And so the idea that you can have people who are Catholics at the same time dabble in the occult and consider themselves men and women of the right is not entirely far-fetched at all. And the comment about Breitbart and these Catholic websites and publications, I think there's no question. I mean, why is Steve Bannon being featured on virtually every Catholic, traditional Catholic website? And you notice, like, even to the point where these traditional Catholic publications previously were condemning Americanism, seem to be using very Americanist language. And if you want to get into Vigano, we can. Archbishop Vigano, I don't know him personally or something like that, but the language he uses about the children of light and the children of darkness. And someone told me that one of the Fatima Center's videos was cheering for Trump as a Marian Pope, which I'm sorry, Marian president. Yeah. That makes no sense to me. Like, he is someone who has advocated gay marriage. Right. I think that was a policy of his regime. He advocates abortion in certain circumstances. I mean, this is something more. People criticize George W. Bush. That was kind of a standard thing, to criticize the neocons and the Bush family and the traditionalist media. But Trump seems more liberal than they are, than those previous neocon Republican presidents were. And just because he gets marched out to the March for Life or gives a message to the March for Life does not mean necessarily he's on our side. Abortion, last time I checked, is still legal in the United States.
And Planned Parenthood funding is higher than ever under the Trump administration. There is deliberate obfuscation here. I'm not going to mention the name of it, but there is a well-known Catholic media outlet that was interviewing a Polish traditional Catholic activist, and he asked the American outlet, what is Trump's position on LGBTQ? And this specific individual, who's well known for casting light on the machinations of the LGBTQ agenda, said that, Trump, he doesn't really think about it, he's just indifferent and so on. And he really minimized Trump's position and the policy of his administration, which is to promote disorder around the world. His administration has openly promoted sodomy abroad, and this individual who is saying that knows that. So there is deliberate dishonesty there, and that is what I think is unconscionable, that traditional Catholics go to these media outlets and there is a deliberate distortion of the nature of the Trump campaign. Furthermore, the COVID supposed vaccine, which Trump has been, the whole of last year was heralding whenever he had the chance, has been developed with aborted fetuses. The several heroic bishops have been very clear that it is unconscionable to take it. I've been clear in this broadcast before about the fact that it's unnecessary because of the hysteria and the disproportionate amplification of the COVID threat. And yet none of these commentators, be they Taylor Marshall, be they The Remnant, several other publications which have really trumpeted the Trump presidency and administration, have mentioned this horror that is being promoted by the figure that they exalt in almost messianic terms. And I mean, if anyone thinks that's hyperbole, Michael Matt said that Trump was like a wounded saint, and Vigano, who we'll maybe discuss a bit more, was saying that Trump is literally the catechon from Thessalonians, the epistle to the Thessalonians, the restrainer of Antichrist, where St. Paul writes that Christians must not behave as if the day of the Lord would happen tomorrow, since the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the epistle of St. John, must be revealed before. St. Paul then adds that the revelation of the Antichrist is conditional upon the removal of someone that restrains him. That's the Greek catechon. And this is who Vigano equates with Trump. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, it is strange. And, it's interesting. There was the Vatican Human Dignity or Dignitatis Humanae Institute conference in 2014, where Steve Bannon announced that this is what they were going to do, that they were going to bring about this populist revolution in 2016. I went over this with Tim Kelly, those who heard that, but that they were going to use the right to promote this new populism that would advocate what he called the Judeo-Christian West. What he argued for was a certain form of free market capitalism, and this organization is very much anti-communist, which is good. We're not saying here communism is good, and we're also, I'd like to say just tangentially, the term never Trumpers, some trads have said, oh, you're never Trumper. One, I personally stuck my neck out in the line for Trump in 2016, was asked to write something for him. And then after the administration started going and we saw a lot of these supposedly unfulfilled promises, then I kind of realized that Trump was not genuine and not real, at least in my opinion.
Sorry, if I could just give a caveat as well. I would like to say to any of our listeners, obviously you can tell by my accent, I did not vote in the American presidential election. Had I had the ability to do so, I would have voted for Donald Trump as the lesser of two evils. But what I'm criticizing is the adulation and the complete willful ignoring of all of his faults and all the harm that he's done to the society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about this with someone earlier today about how, there was that famous Remnant article where I think it was Patrick Archibald had written about the appearance of the constellation Virgo, and there was this alignment that happened that was something out of Revelation 12. And this was immediately, I believe, before the advent of the Trump administration. So this idea that Trump is going to be somehow a savior of the West is, I think, completely false. I think it's quite the opposite, that what we have coming now in the Biden administration is enabled by the things that happened during the Trump administration. I think that, things work in dialectics. And so you have the Dylan Roof shooting, and then all of a sudden, just magically the next day, literally, the Confederate flag is a symbol of murder. You have Charlottesville, and then right after that, all these people get pulled off of social media. Even people have nothing to do with the alt-right officially. Then you have the Capitol siege, and now they're just chomping at the bit for this imminent crackdown. What did the Capitol siege accomplish? Not a great deal. I'm not saying everyone there is evil or terrible or something like this, but if we look at the Trump administration as basically a catalyst for what's coming in the Biden administration. So it's not as though Trump bad, Biden good, or something along those lines. And it's also interesting to look at some of the origins of QAnon and retired Brigadier General Paul Vallely, and supposedly his association with Michael Aquino, who probably most of the people in the conspiracy world know of as the founder of the Temple of Set. There's a lot of allegations against him. I don't know if they're true, but he wrote a manual on psychological warfare.
Yeah.
So people talk about the QAnon grift. I mean, there are people grifting off QAnon right now, or they did, but it's a psychological warfare technique. And what happened was, just as Bannon, and this sort of like neo-populist, rebranded Zionist, Judeo-Christian, political and economic and military. And there's actually a weird connection with China and with Japan as well, and Korea as well. But that this group came in 2020 and thought, we're going to use traditional Catholicism. Why is Ali Alexander, who is this Republican operative, I don't know his heart, maybe he's a genuinely good Catholic, I'm not sure, but why is he like promoting the Latin Mass on Twitter? What it was they saw that Catholics are moving in this direction. And there was a very good article. It was in an alt-right publication. I'm not endorsing the alt-right here or something like that, but it talked about how this America First movement around Nick Fuentes and these other figures associated with kind of InfoWars, Alex Jones, sort of like the official approved conspiracy movement, that the idea was to shift the alt-right away from ethno-nationalism into Catholicism. Now, in principle, that's good. I'm obviously ethnic identity is important. A sign of the end times is the abolition of ethnic identity into a global unit, as opposed to the church where we're all, able to maintain our identity but be part of this global church. But what was done was traditional Catholicism was used, and I think this is the key point we have to emphasize. Traditional Catholicism was used as a way to corral people into a political and social movement. And so these different, there was a meeting that was had in South Florida, which is where Trump is, where certain people from Russia have settled, and they have a mafia regime there. And the bulk of traditional Catholic media figures, as well as one traditional Catholic organization, at least one of priests, were invited, and there was an agenda set. Now, we don't know exactly what went on there, but allegedly, it was to kind of tame the trad movement. You can tell, read some of these publications, I won't name them, but read any of these publications 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and what they publish now, just radically different. What things are they not allowed to say in 2021? One traditional Catholic publisher told me specifically his newspaper is read by rabbis, I believe he said that, and he said for sure members of the Jewish community. Like, kind of keep an eye on it. And he was proud of that. Which was, and I'm not saying this to like attack any ethnic group or anything like that. My point is that this whole thing has been co-opted to serve a particular agenda. If you look at Trump's pardons, why is he pardoning? What do Israeli spies and rappers have in common? Like, why is he pardoning all these people? Yeah. Like, who does that serve? What country has President Trump benefited the most? Now, people say, well, he didn't, he did tomahawk bombed Syria, but he pulled out of, Iraq and Syria. That's all good. But that was just a pause, just like the pro-life thing is a pause. In my opinion, the Republicans it's like, oh, we'll cut these little things here and there, and they're good. We don't want to be funding abortion, and even a little baby step, I guess it's an appropriate pun, a little baby step is good, but this is all a trick. Just like, I've talked about this in other shows, just like the March for Life itself is a beautiful witness. I've been to many March for Life, been out there in the cold, in the snow, but what that does is is used as a safety valve. So you can go to your March for Life, right, which I have, and I would encourage people to do, and it is a terrible scandal that it was canceled this year, but that's used as a safety valve, just like George W. Bush waving around like the Defense of Marriage Act, right? Yeah. There is a goal. We're going in one direction to the Antichrist system, and they'll slow it down in this sense with Trump or Bush or whoever, Nikki Haley, whoever it is, and then they put the pedal to the metal under Biden.
So two steps forward, one step back, or like 5 steps forward, half a shuffle back.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Well, I'd like to get into the architecture of this manipulation and talk about the CNP, Opus Dei, Jewish power, all the elements that have interacted in this constellation. So I think, firstly, I'd just like to mention that in one of your posts, you talked about these Web 2.0 figures. And I think that it's worth just saying something about how today's technology, today's media, social media, the way that people get their information, their news, is really important to this. This is a very different setup in a way to the kind of neoconservative journals and sort of mainstream terrestrial news channel methods of disseminating their ideologies. It's kind of more diffuse and less, it appears to be less establishment, less formalized, shall we say. But maybe that's just an appearance.
Yeah, I think appearance is the most important thing to this. And I'm going to say this in charity. I've really, the past couple of years, tried to emphasize the importance of charity in the research and publications I do. Taylor Marshall is, in a certain sense, how he presents on the internet. And it's his hairstyle, it's his beard. Even other Catholic figures are trying to imitate his beard and stuff like that. And there is a sense that there is a sense, and people make the joke about early Gen X soccer moms and Taylor Marshall or something, but I don't mean that to be disparaging. I mean, those people are very good, and the more experience I have with intellectuals and stuff like that, the more I cherish good, normal people, however bourgeois or whatever they are, it doesn't matter. So people get on there and they see Taylor Marshall looking good, and he's regurgitating stuff from like Catholic Family News from like 10 years ago. And I think that's a huge part of it. And there's an enormous dopamine rush. This is an old meme, actually a year-old meme now, like dopamine hits and stuff like that on the internet. But like that you get from going on Twitter, and there's something that's racially charged, and there's something that's impure, and there's this and that and the other thing, and people are just getting high off of that. And, this is an interesting point. I'm not a sedevacantist. I don't know. I'm not dismissing the sedevacantist viewpoint right now. I just don't know at all. And I'm not a theologian, so I'm not someone to turn to for this. But some of the journalistic work sedevacantists do are very, it's been very, they make some good points when they critique the recognize and resist position. And one of the points is that what we've had for the past 60 years is various figures that function almost like antipopes. So Archbishop Vigano has been referred to not as an anti-pope, but it's something like that, where we have the Pope saying one thing, and this other figure saying another. And I don't know if that's okay or not, but we look for these people. And in the journalism world, this has happened. Like Scott Hahn was the first super Catholic apologist and journalist. Now, he was the first Catholic journalist, I mean, not journalist, but Catholic apologist who was a superstar. I mean, of course, it was Bishop Fulton Sheen. There were others too, but like
layman.
American, friendly, bearded, Catholic guy, and people turned to Scott Hahn. So at that time we had John Paul II and Scott Hahn, and these figures were like Hegelian, like Hegel's description of Napoleon, and everyone's out Hegeled out, and there's all these Hegel references or whatever. I'll admit freely, I don't understand most of what Hegel says, but there's that famous line where Hegel he looks out his window and he saw Napoleon, and he's like, this is the world spirit. So people thought like John Paul II will be the absolute teaching figure. Scott Hahn will be, or Tim Staples, or something along those lines. And then later these other people come, and I'm not saying everything they say is bad. I'm not saying it's bad that they're presenting these positions, but people will go to them. And what, in my opinion, you should go to is the teaching of the Catholic Church. We could pull up all kinds of crazy, and I don't mean that word uncharitably, but just odd things Taylor Marshall has said about different visions he's had and dreams and stuff like that. Maybe he did. It just seemed a little bit odd. And this is not where we should be going to. Like, this is Cardinal Newman. People criticize him or whatever, but he said mysticism begins in mist and ends in schism. I'm not saying that trads are in schism or something. For heaven's sakes, I've written for every trad journal there is pretty much. But I would not go to these figures. Even, I don't want to get too much TMI, but people will come up to me at different parishes and be like, well, Jesse, what do you think about this or that? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an expert. I'm a journalist, and I try to report on certain things that I see as fit. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's extremely dangerous to turn to media as the promoters of doctrine. And the media, the 2.0 media, is mostly shine and appearance, where people get cozy and they get that dopamine rush by looking at these people on the internet talking.
So just to define that, 2.0, Web 2.0 is, I understand, it's the internet that you interact with, sort of conversational. Yeah. So it's got that feedback mechanism as opposed to the kind of older iteration of the internet, which was
1997 like GeoCities webpage or something like that, where it's got this conspiracy. You know what? Here, I'm sorry, just 2 seconds. What's interesting, I'll say something good about Taylor Marshall's infiltration is that he corrects some conspiracies. He talks about the apparitions at La Salette, and in there, he does correct like some misconceptions about that, and other people have had too. That these rumors like Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich says this or that, and it's like, well, let's just see what one. This is private revelation. And that's another point I'd like to make as well, is I think it's dangerous, in my opinion, to base the entirety of our faith on an apparition or on some private revelation or on this like hodgepodge narrative of all these private revelation. I mean, we should be turning to the deposit of faith, the teaching of the church. Yeah. We should think clearly, and I'm not being a rationalist or a naturalist or something like that. I believe, in obviously the approved apparitions of the church. I believe that they're true. I even am at least open to some of the conspiracy theorizing around those. But I think you walk down that world, it's like walking into the Minotaur's labyrinth. And there's a lot of, especially in the Trad 1.0 movement, a lot of very strange people and very strange, things going on. And then the 2.0, it's a lot of it is like aesthetics. And at least for some people, it seems to be grift. And especially when we have traditionalist writers who are having like these emotional crises on Twitter, that's not a good thing. Like, that's not healthy. Like, there's something wrong there. And if you're going there and like, oh, what's he got to say about this? What's he got to say about that? If they manifest that they're having serious crises of faith and serious emotional issues, they should not be the representatives of the church.
Yeah, I think there's some excellent points, and we all face that temptation, or at least a lot of us do, most of us do, with social media and the vice of curiosity. Absolutely. And looking to know more than is proper for our station in life, and allowing us to distract us from our obligations of prayer and our duties of life, and particularly in this time of lockdown and all sorts of social occasions being banned, that temptation is all the greater, I think. One thing you mentioned is, and it's particularly because this phenomenon we're talking about, this Neotraditionalism, this Trad Inc., it's Anglophone, and it is a peculiarly American phenomenon by and large. One thing that's very, very much a feature of it is what's called always be marketing. For $22.99 a month, I will teach you the 7 steps of how to be a man. You'll also receive an Archbishop Vigano t-shirt and a Pachamama dunking mug. This is the kind of sales patter that goes into it. And with some of these figures, there is money to be made there, through this kind of very American talent. I think that there was someone who pointed out that Marshall, in particular through Patreon, was getting something like $20,000 a month just through that stream of income, let alone what he's getting through publishing and Catholics for Trump or whatever. So that's something I think to be wary of, that there is a financial incentive to some of these figures to actually generate clicks. Is it that different from what a lot of the media do by profiting from controversy? And really, in a sense, profiting from the church's woes. How many Pachamama videos do you need? But that's not to say that the modernist infiltration in the church is not horrendous. But that situation in the church has driven Catholics into looking to alternative outlets for analysis of what is going on in this contemporary crisis. The other thing I'd like to point out is, as you say, that what traditionalist outlets are allowed to say now is very different. And I think one sign that our listeners can look out for in whether to trust particular outlets is whether those particular figures or outlets are open to discussing everything, or if there are certain subjects they won't address, because that usually for me indicates some element of dishonesty. So, for example, Rarate Chaley, who had previously mentioned E. Michael Jones's work, wrote a Twitter post, I think in the last year or so, condemning anti-Semitism. Of course, we condemn any hatred towards Jews or any kind of ethnic animosity or anything like that. But as listeners are no doubt aware, that particular accusation is used to quash any discussion or analysis of contemporary Jewish power. Similarly, LifeSite News ran an article by Dr. Alan Phimister saying that Christians must resist the diabolical re-emergence of anti-Semitism. Okay, well, let's see what he says. In one paragraph he says, from a Christian perspective, it is impossible to ignore the obvious diabolical origin of this attack on the kin of the Messiah. Okay, well, yes, and once this fact is recognized, perceiving the long anticipation of 20th century secular anti-Semitism in the interconfessional disputes that disfigured the ages of faith chills the blood and weighs down the head of every follower of Christ. I think that's so hyperbolic, and by basically assuming those kind of precepts, one is in an impossible position to be able to critique genuine malign influence on politics, the church and state.
I think I've gotten into a debate about this with a few other people. I think that what we have in the deep state is conservative Zionists, liberal Zionists, and then one of these people was in the Trump administration, Jewish white nationalists who are Zionists, like the harder right.
Is that Stephen Miller or?
Yeah, I could say so. I don't know that for sure, but maybe I do. But it's been suggested to me very strongly, and that group seems to there's a genius behind all of this. So they know that there is a lot of E. Michael Jones's book. Whatever might be said about E. Michael Jones, to swear that way, he's always been very good to me. And
he is willing to discuss things.
Yeah, and the Jewish revolutionary spirit has enormous effect on Catholic discourse. I've gone to traditionalist parish and seen priests reading it. It's had, and people may agree or disagree with the thesis.
Don't let the bishops see them doing that.
Yeah, but there's this awareness there of that. And so, and they know that the neoconservatism is dead. Like it reached its apogee under George W. Bush, and then it's collapsed completely.
Well, some people are trying to keep it going. George Weigel, Robert George.
Yeah, but they have prestige, but nobody reads their stuff really anymore. And I recently got a review copy of George Weigel's book, like The Next Pope or something like that. It's really, I don't know. I will say, here, I'll throw some stuff out there. I have gone to the same mass as George Weigel. He spoke. I've heard him speak and stuff like that. I don't know his heart or where he is, but that movement is over with, and people were aware of that. People have said this about Steve Bannon. If you watch the Frontline interviews, especially the first one in PBS, it's just amazing how intelligent he is. Right. He's clearly extremely, we joke about 180 IQ. I don't know, but extremely intelligent. And this is something, again, I'm going to say in charity, a lot of journalists and trad and trad whatever, conservative Catholic journalists are not geniuses. I don't mean that out of malice, but they're put in there, and I forget who asked me a question along these lines, they're put in there to toe a certain line. I think maybe at least some of them have always been in there. When I was talking about the World Anti-Communist League, the Moonies, it was called the New Right. It's not
Nouvelle Droite.
No, but in America it's called the New Right. It was like the point at which Midwestern and Southern conservatism and Nixonian conservatism kind of coalesced with neoconservatism and the emerging social conservatism of Jerry Falwell and people like that. And that was there. And then what happened was the old right, and everyone knows, it's got crushed. Pat Buchanan, Joseph Sowell. That all that sort of holdover from the Second World War as well, the Iron Guard, fascism, Francoism, that all got crushed. And so that's why the post-millennial national, what is the name of that group? It's not the NPI. That's Richard Spencer's group, right? The NPC. What was the group you had mentioned? The National Policy.
Oh, the CNP, the Council for National Policy.
The Council
I'd like to get onto that.
Yeah. So the MO of
an umbrella.
Neo-populist right today is don't explicitly praise Israel, but don't attack it either. And so you'll see that in even changes in this sort of America First crew, as far as I can tell, and in trad media. You can't do that. There's some allowance for some criticism of Jewish people in that group, but it has to be toned down. It has to be regulated. It has to be controlled to a certain degree. You have to, you can kind of criticize capitalism, but and I won't mention any of these families' names, but some of these families who support these groups are finance capitalists. And so if you attack capitalism, you attack them. So that's been toned down. So I would say that, it's very controlled, it's very planned. And this is something, I won't mention his name, but an old school person I very much trust, who is one of the major paleocon figures, I won't mention his name, people can kind of guess, but had told me, that in the relationship between Catholics and Jews in the neoconservative movement, the Catholics are the gullible ones. The neo-traditionalists, the neo-populists, the civ nationalists, it's the same way, where they are fed stuff. Clearly, like, why is there going to be an identical article? Like, some of these media outlets hate each other, but they'll have like almost identical articles about Trump this, Trump that. Everyone gets a copy of Vigano's latest letters that, it's fine to have a ghostwriter, it's fine to have an editor, you should have an editor, but like, they look so contrived, and they have these like explosive like terms like about Fatima or the oath to modernism. So we're in 2021, and Archbishop Vigano mentions this ancient trad talking point about the oath to modernism. Yes, the oath against modernism, or that is good. That's a good thing to have. We should have that. People should talk about that. But it just seems, in my opinion, just kind of thrown out there as clickbait. So, Latin Mass, great, vote for Trump. Modernism is bad because it doesn't upset the power structure. And I think it's a key thing to understand, is that you have, just like the March for Life is a beautiful thing. I've done it. I'll do it again. But nonetheless, it doesn't upset, at least in my view, the power structure. It doesn't in Planned Parenthood.
Yeah.
It may eventually, it may be a powerful witness, and our Lord will do this because the prayer is said there. But it's allowed for that reason. I guess it's been shut down now. It probably will never happen again. Who knows? Or at least in our lifetime. The same thing with a lot of this other stuff. It's fine. You want to pray the rosary, in the view of a lot of these people, that's fine. Just support Trump, who moved the embassy to you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's essential for, the Golan Heights being annexed or whatever, and then we're throwing all this stuff. Latin Mass, modernism. It's almost like a game in a certain sense. Now, these things are important. The Mass is extremely important. It's more important than the Golan Heights or any of these things. But in the view of the people controlling neo-trad media, that's just like Halloween candy to be given us, so that we support President Trump and do the Jericho March. Yeah.
And meanwhile, what is it, like 50,000 American restaurants are going to go out of business forever because of the scamdemic. So it's not what they say, these neo-trad figures, it's what they omit. And what has really disgusted me, quite frankly, is that during this whole I've given quite a bit of coverage on this channel to the scamdemic. Yes, COVID exists, but obviously the hugely disproportionate response is concealing a multitude of agendas that are continuing, and Trump himself paid out billions in federal aid to hospitals for COVID diagnoses, creating an incentive for the false positive case-demic. He renewed the National Emergency Declaration, which keeps American businesses, institutions, and state governments under dictatorial rules. And you didn't hear any of this really from figures like Marshall over the course of last year. And the Trump White House has pressured states to implement mask mandates. So he's continuing to enforce the Great Reset in weekly directives to state governments, kept Anthony Fauci on, a proven liar and con man who is a de facto employee of Bill Gates. He's deployed the military, which has no business overseeing medical care to distribute vaccines. It is Trump who's one of the most vocal supporters of vaccines, this key aspect of the Great Reset and its plan for digital surveillance. And this is all coming down the track towards Catholics. These figures have just, in a sense, sort of ignored it. And as you say, well, Trump is the most pro-life president ever, so shut up and just vote for Trump. So that's the situation. I wanted to get your thoughts on three figures and to use them to maybe explain to our audience a little bit more about the phenomenon of esoteric traditionalism or perennialism. So those three figures are Olavo de Carvalho, Alexander Dugin, and Steve Bannon, because these are the figures that are often held up as representing the contemporary sort of esoteric traditionalist movement. Not a movement people are not so aware of, but Bannon and Dugin basically met secretly in November 2018. So that was after Bannon's removal from the Trump administration. And he was pursuing a range of neo-populist campaigns throughout the world. And he's also, interestingly, being paid a handsome salary by a Chinese expat to find ways of frustrating the ruling Communist Party of China. How much have you heard Neotrad Catholic media bang on about China as if it's China that's locking us down and destroying the economy of the West? Not saying that China's not an enemy or a problem, but let's just, get a bit of perspective here. And Dugin had been in Shanghai, where he's a guest professor at Fudan University, working to advocate for greater integration among China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey against the US. So there's a backdrop here of geopolitics, of maneuvering, of deception.
Well, there's so much there. I don't know where to start. So I will start with this. There is a very famous traditionalist bishop. I won't mention his name. He himself was very generous and kind with me. I'm not endorsing his position or anything like that. But he had confirmed to me there were dissemination of René Guénon and I believe Avila as well, or those sort of perennialist ideas. There was an attempt. There was a struggle in various traditionalist groups in Europe, and this was another traditionalist writer had confirmed this to me, that those ideas tried to seep into traditionalism. Now, behind Bannon is some sort of watered down Avolianism. And Avila, I'm not an expert on him, people correct me, but there's this idea that, and I say this as someone who's like about as much Indo-European DNA as an American can have. Almost the entirety of my ancestry is Germanic, and this by implication Indo-European. But this idea that there's like this Indo-European religion in the Vedic text, and that Christianity has heavily influenced by this Indo-European religion, but it has these kind of unpleasant additions from the Near East. And I think that's the idea behind using traditional Catholicism. It's like, well, the traditional at Mass has these elements of like Indo-European, like courtly behavior or ritual. I don't know how true that is. I think there is some truth to that, but nonetheless, that it can be utilized because all of these religions, the good ones, are manifestations, even Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism to a certain degree, of this Indo-European religion. And so this is just like Masonry. This is just like Theosophy. It's just like the New Age movement. It's just the right-wing version of it. So Catholicism is just a mask or a face for this Indo-European religion. Interestingly, there are Catholic presses who have published works advocating these positions. A friend of mine and I was talking about this earlier, and there's a whole backstory behind some of these weird stories about some of these traditional Catholic presses of books. So Bannon comes in and he is a softcore, I think, Evolian. Remember, fascism is not the same thing as racism. And there were Jews who were in Mussolini's government. It's more like an authoritarian movement. So German National Socialism and National Socialist ideas were present for example, in Spain, but for obvious reasons, because they're very med and very early European farmer, they're not going to embrace this like Arianism or something like that. So Bannon's version is Judeo-Christian. It's somewhat pro-capitalist. It's at the behest of these, Chinese billionaires, Jewish billionaires, but there's also like the Eric Prince, neocon Catholic, and also
DeVos.
Protestant fundamentalist wing as well.
Yeah.
These books written by Jewish journalists about Protestant evangelical cults in Washington, D.C. are not totally wrong. I'm not saying that Protestants rule the world or evangelicals rule the world, but when people focus on just one group, you're missing the point. I'm not saying that particular group from Eurasia, who's visiting, who's caused so much harm to our people and to the church, are good, not by any means at all. But they are one faction. They're extremely powerful. I saw that meme, I'm sure you did, about the 10 most important positions in the Biden administration and which ethnicity is filling those positions. It's not the Irish. So I get that. But you have to understand that this is like a multipolar complex of groups, and one of them is right wing. And that it's not Christian. It's not about devotion to our Lord. And when they say traditionalism, they mean perennialism. They mean this new age, the right wing. Remember, what's her name? The Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky, was an Arianist. They thought, that's Tibet and, the Indus Valley, that's the source of wisdom or whatever. And they believed in racial hierarchy and eugenics and that sort of thing. So egalitarianism in the contemporary sense is not good. Diversity in the contemporary sense is not a good thing. But racialism, especially Gnostic racialism, I think that's the key dividing point, is that these Aristotle and theosophical right-wing cults that Ebolianism comes out of, this idea that our blood makes us God, or the Indo-European part of our blood makes us God. I'm very Indo-European. I'm very proud of that. I have a very strong fascination of my ancestry, and but I don't think I'm a god, and I don't think my genetics make me a god, despite the great things my ancestors did. That is the key difference, and that is Gnostic as well. And Black nationalists believe the same thing. They're like the whole that they built all the great things around the world and all the famous European scholars and philosophers. But it's the same Gnostic satanic idea, like their blood makes them noble. Jews, especially like the Chabad, I think it's the Chabad Levitz or whatever, some of these cults of Sabbatean Frankists, like, we have this chosen blood, we're the chosen people, and the other people are not even human, we're gods. So now with Alexander Dugin, the key issue I think there is this desire to destroy. There's a Crowleyism present there. There's a crossover with the alt-right, and this desire to destroy the West and to bring about this Eurasian empire. And Masonry is bad. Anglo-American liberalism is bad. But I don't want to be ruled over by a combination of Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity and Hinduism or something like that, empire of Russians and Chinese or whatever, and Israelis as well, over the entire world. So I think what people need to realize is that there is Israeli influence, there is Sunni Muslim influence, there is Shiite Islam influence, there is Russian influence, there's Russian Jewish influence, there's Anglo-American influence and Masonic influence, and there is, even especially when we go back early in the 20th century, like NATO, Gladio B, Italian, French, even Austrian, certain Austrian noble families, influence in the church that is not Christian, in Catholic media and conservative media in general. It's not Christian. It's nothing to do. It's something, I'm on a Lyndon LaRouche post here. Lyndon LaRouche said this about certain trad movements in the church. They're Gnostic cults that have nothing to do with Christianity. I say that as a traditional Catholic. I say that as someone who, makes a great deal of effort to go to the traditional Latin Mass and who has fought for traditionalism, Catholic traditionalism. And I've seen, many people, especially kind of waking up to this on the internet, that there's something wrong here in some of these groups. Some of these groups have been infiltrated. So there's a famous traditionalist writer, I won't mention him, who publicly reads the tarot, who is involved with Gnostic, literally church, Gnostic churches in Los Angeles. And it's open, it's public, it's out there. He brags about it. I've seen circuitously defending himself against this. I mean, this is an evil there. So it doesn't matter how base they are, how trad or red-pilled or whatever. Satanism is a poison, and to even flirt with that a little bit is extremely dangerous.
I think that I mentioned a red flag for when considering these figures is when if they refuse to talk about certain things. That for me has always been a red flag. Second red flag a fixation on a single problem or a single group of people as the enemy. As you say, it's a hydra that we're facing. There are factions of the elite power structure. Ultimately, the devil's behind it, but those human instruments are often feuding, advancing this dialectical progression. For example, this is an example, I think, something that's not particularly helpful. Cardinal Burke, who I think is a an honest man. I don't know his heart. He said obviously some very good things, but he gave a sermon recently about the Great Reset, and again, a lot of trad figures got very excited. But I would just urge listeners to actually read the text of that speech, because then there's nothing heterodox or anything like that, but as he's talking about what America's going through, a crisis which threatens its very future, is free and democratic. Okay, well, that's, the church isn't necessarily there to advocate for liberal democracy, but the worldwide spread of Marxist materialism, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. But then he says, to attain economic gains, we as a nation have permitted ourselves to become dependent upon the Chinese Communist Party. And then the way that his sermon then progresses almost infers, again, he uses the term Wuhan virus, that the blame for the lockdowns and the restrictions that, as I say, are devastating the economy and society is all to blame on the Chinese Communist Party. Again, it's too singular, and it omits the reality that there are state governments, national governments in the West who are clearly lying and have ulterior motives for the ongoing tyranny that they are imposing on Western populations. So I think we've got to be very careful of that. On the other hand, Steve Bannon was looking to sort of institutionalize this neo-traditionalist movement with what he called the Dignitatis Humanae Institute under an Englishman called Benjamin Harnwell. And they bought a monastery in Italy, I believe, a former monastery, and he wanted to start there a gladiator school to defend Judeo-Christian civilization. So a number of interesting donors to that cause, I think and Cardinal Burke actually pulled out there. He did that. He was clearly seeing the way that Bannon was looking to kind of mold and shape that particular project, and didn't see that it concorded with the interests of Holy Mother Church.
The definition of fascism is, and I think this is what distinguished genuine Catholics in the Francoist regime from the followers of Primo de Rivera, I think his name is that in fascism, it's using the church as an instrument of the state. And that is what, that is Avolianism, or Avolianism light that Bannon peddles. That is Duginism in a certain degree as well. And so that's, I think, the purpose of the Dignitatis Humanae Institute. Yoram Razani wrote his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, and in there he advocates for, this alliance between Israel, Holland, England, the United States, and nation states. He hates the EU. Why the EU has been condemning Israel. And the EU is becoming some weird communist Muslim state or something like that. And it's sad. I mean, this is our temporal, homeland of our people, but it's pretty much, been lost. And so I'm not saying the EU is good, but all of this stuff is meant to counterbalance that. I think even Brexit as well is meant to break the power of the EU, because the EU is the liberal side of the New World Order.
The left wing, yeah.
Yeah, for whatever reason, it's pro-Jewish, but anti-Israel or anti-Zionist to a certain degree. There are elements of that. And so and it's important to realize, and this may trigger people, I've probably been triggering people all night, but that Judaism and Jews are not entirely united in everything. That there are strong factions, and this is something, that I have some knowledge of based on correspondence with different people, that there are fierce and violent hatreds in there, and that they have different visions of the future. There's this vision of, greater Israel, and obviously a lot of Jewish people are very sympathetic to that, but there's also this idea of diversity, utopia of some kind. I want to bring something, the article I mentioned, I don't want to just sort of rant, but I want to give some meat here. And this is an article. It's on an alt-right website, and I'm not going to mention the name of it. I did not write this article, and I was directed by someone else to it. But it's a essay written by Milo Yiannopoulos. Now, Milo Yiannopoulos has been featured on various trad organizations. He's someone who claims to be Catholic. I don't know.
He also claims to be married to another man.
That is true. He's writing about the America First movement around Nick Fuentes, and that movement is sort of the more harder-edged, younger version of the Neotrad movement. He says he's talking about it, and they're talking about the Groypers, which are these like frog characters.
So that refers to an Egyptian god. Is it the god of chaos or something?
Yeah, Cat. It's interesting. Chaos magic is used by Crowley and by Dugan as well. And there were chaos symbols at Charlottesville. So I don't, and again, like I'm surprised the amount of people know my writings and stuff, but like I am not leftist or someone who is contrary to the importance of ethnic identity to people. But I think there are real bad actors in these groups, and not just because of their personal lives and the things they've done or whatever. But in this article, Milo writes, "It is true that this side of the aisle contains some genuine racist remnants of Richard Spencer's thankfully deceased alt-right, and people who flirt in an ugly and reprehensible fashion with Nazi ideas. Now, it's interesting, in the old order, this old right, and I would say this is a false right too, there was a lot of sympathy to National Socialism at the Second World War and collaboration between Zionists and National Socialists. And I'm not endorsing National Socialism or anything, but that's a small size slice," Milo writes, continues, "of an emerging youth movement that, in my view, we should embrace and seek to enlighten rather than reject a name call. I do have some serious questions for Fuentes about the Groyper worldview. For one thing, I want to know why they seem so obsessed with Israel and so rarely talk about Islam. And it is a streak of envious anti-Semitism, or a principled stand on foreign aid to a country that doesn't need it and might be better off without it. Personally, I'm an unrestricted Zionist because I think we need a strong ally in the Middle East from which to nuke Mecca. In my view, in my opinion, Milo is paid to say things like that. I don't know if he cares either way. Maybe he does really believe it. I don't know. But interesting there, in that paragraph, we have a discussion of don't focus on Israel, focus on Islam, right? I'm not saying Islam is good. I don't think it is. But that, like, who benefits from Christians and Jews fighting each other? Who benefits, I'm sorry, for heaven's sakes, for Christians and Muslims fighting each other? Who benefits from that? Who's benefited the most from the war on terror? Has our people, it's our civilization, has Muslims benefited from that? Who really has? So it's trying to it's trying to revive neoconservatism, but give it a different name and
so
be clever and be like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't give Israel money, but then we still give it to them anyways. Maybe, I'm not a big Israel fan, but we could nuke Mecca. That'd be so base. I mean, that's a joke, obviously, that he's making, but, that would not be a good thing. I'm not saying Muslims are good or something, or Islam is good, but I don't know how that could be justified according to Catholic just war theory. But he notes that Fuentes himself told his followers to lay off the Israel stuff. And he basically goes, and the guy at alt-right guy writing this points this out, so I'm stealing it from him, that it's trying to focus ethnic identity into the Christian faith. As I said earlier, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but remember, this is a trap to use against us. And it's not like, oh, I hope for genuine conversions. Like, I want people to focus on QAnon and Jericho marches and Trump and whatever. And because what happened was, even though the alt-right was promoted by these different figures, Bannon, Yiannopoulos, it got out of control. And it became a serious threat because if we have Englishmen and women who have a strong ethnic identity and who are devout Christians, then the New World Order is not coming about. It's not going to come about. If we have, Canadians or Americans or whatever, if we have that. Now, again, I don't encourage this Gnostic worship of race. Yeah, so this is basically Milo, who has worked with Bannon, and I've talked about this on other shows, that this is basically saying they're going to use the American First movement, at least try to use it to corral the alt-right and push it in a different direction. And all these figures Milo wasn't there, but Nick Fuentes, these other America First people were at the Capitol siege. What has been the result of the Capitol siege? Well, thousands, tens of thousands of National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., lots of good people going to jail, some bad actors going to jail, but lots of good people going to jail, their lives ruined. And now, and I've even seen this, is impending crackdown on Christians, conservatives, anyone, so it's absolutely genius. And the last point I'll make here in regard to that is that who is behind, these Chinese billionaires and figures behind Bannon? A cult. A Mooney-esque cult called Falun Gong that runs the Epoch Times. It's funny, a lot of normie people I know are like, oh, I've started reading the Epoch Times. I'm red pilled or whatever. So remember, the CIA has used cults in the past. That is the real answer to MK Ultra. It's not individual like celebrities who are out of their mind, which is probably the case, but that we are being manipulated through QAnon, through trad media, through all these neo-populist groups. I was looking on Gab, and it's all these World Net Daily articles that are listed under there. That is a apocalyptic Zionist evangelical publication, and they'll throw some truth out there. So we have to think outside of like libs good, conservatives bad, or vice versa. Like we have to, as Christians, first and foremost, look for the truth of the faith. So it's not as though like these George Soros left cap journalists are good and the, Sheldon Adelson and other people paid, trad media is bad, or vice versa. It's that both of these groups are emissaries of people who are pulling their strings. And because of their sinfulness, their mental health issues, their need for money, they're able to be manipulated. Like, I don't know if it was you or some other journalist asked me, like, how do you get into these positions? Like, how do they know to look for? And it's very clear, right? If you're smart, you're going to be tossed out. If you're honestly searching, you have Socratic humility or Heideggerian attunement, you're going to be out. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not going to be in these media outlets because you have to be someone who can be controlled by someone smarter than you.
Yeah. And for anyone that thinks, well, why are we talking about the alt-right, the constellation of trad media? Left Cath figures have done some work in documenting the kind of flirtation and overlap between the two sort of constellations. The Twitter follow lists of Taylor Marshall, Tim Gordon, Steve Skojec, this kind of tightly knit Catholic digital media network, do show some interaction. Figures like Paul Joseph Watson, Stefan Molyneux, this kind of so-called race realist, and then Faith Goldie, who one blog, Call Me Jorge Bergoglio, alleged was a Russian intelligence asset. These are kind of borderline ethno-nationalists. Well, for example, Goldie claims to be Catholic, and Marshall and Gordon have each appeared on her YouTube channel, and Nicholas has interacted with her tweets more than 100 times since 2017. And that, of course, now following someone on Twitter does not necessarily indicate agreement with their ideology, but I think it's just we should be aware that some kind of crossover and influence can occur. So I would like to just get your thoughts a bit more on the architecture of this system. So we brought up Major General Paul E. Vallely. People have speculated quite strongly, I think, that he is very much involved with the QAnon PSYOP, because he appeared on, I think it was Jack Posobiec's television thing, saying that QAnon comes out of a group called the Army of Northern Virginia. This is a group of military intelligence specialists of over 800 people that advise the president. So this is where Q picks up and gets a lot of their information. So he's kind of signaling there that he's in the know on something. Then you have the Council for National Policy you mentioned, which is a conservative, quote-unquote, umbrella organization, which has really sort of shaped the direction of American fusionist conservatism since the 80s. And you just look at the list of people that are members of that, it's quite incredible, the sort of myriad of figures you have there. And this all leads to really strange QAnon, almost Kabbalah-esque posting about going from dark to light. So yeah, this is the the sort of panorama we see. And I want to just get your thoughts on that architecture, and also Opus Dei, which has a very strong and influential position in Catholic media, and the ownership and direction of a lot of these outlets.
I guess I'll answer that in a couple different ways. One is, if you understand some of these groups as being cults, like cults, like Scientology cults, like Nexium, like Jehovah's Witnesses. And what these groups desire is power and survival. I hate Star Trek, no offense to the readers, but I'll use a Star Trek reference, that these groups are like the Borg, where they want to survive. So you'll think, and you and I think I've talked about this off air, like, why is it that some of these groups will say, some of their members seem to say like pro-Pope Francis things, and others say anti-Pope Francis things? Like, what is going on? Or some of these groups like change like their teaching in the course of 10 to 15 years, and they radically, shift and have all these breakaways. But there is overlap. There was a report I shared with you that is on the CIA's website. The CIA took it down recently, actually, but you can get it on the Wayback Machine, the Covert Action Information Bulletin, where they talk about the religious right and about crossover between these different Catholic groups and the Moonies. So if you understand it in those terms, some of their behavior is just simply gaining power, trying to defend themselves, shifting around their different views, trying to recruit people, trying to do PR for themselves, that these are cults in there. Now, there is a crossover supposedly between Opus Dei and the Pinay group, Le Cercle, these different right-wing groups in Europe. And again, the right-wing, I consider myself a person of the right, without a doubt, but these different groups in Europe that seem to function collaboratively with NATO. And there's some weird connections between Otto von Habsburg and the what's his name, Count Kalergi? I forget his full name, but in this idea of the formation of Europe and the European Union there. And some people have said some very critical things about the Habsburgs. I don't know how true they are, but there's a lot of information about Otto von Habsburg kind of being caught up in that. I would say that at least some of these groups, that naming them, are without a doubt cults, or they became cults, or they were infiltrated, or maybe they were seeded to fight the Cold War, and then they kind of went off on their own. They're no longer controlled. They don't have a direct red line to Langley or something like that. And once you understand that other things like this have existed in the past, that have almost the identical marks of these groups, and like Albigensians, that there's different groups of priests that go off in the mountains with women in Italy in the 13th century and stuff like that, or during the Counter-Reformation, that things like this exist, that it makes sense, because people will be just like they were in the JP2 era, was Father so-and-so, or, televangelist so-and-so, they say, pray the rosary, and they wear their collar, and they say the Novus Ordo so reverently. The same thing can be true to the trad world. They know you just have to put an incenser or something like that up there, or this quote from Cardinal Ottaviani or something like that, and it's oh wow, let's go in there, let's give them Patreon hits, and we're going to join them and go there. The mark of a Christian is charity. It's not being a cartoon character, it's not being goofy, but it's charity, and a religious movement with the Latin Mass or whatever, and all the smells and bells and whistles without charity is just a Gnostic cult.
I would suggest to listeners they consider the following counterfactual. Ask yourself how opposed to the scamdemic and vaccine, say Michael Matt, Marshall, other outlets would have been if it had occurred under a Hillary Clinton presidency. Or to put it another way, would Hillary have been able to sell the vax to millions of Christians and conservatives? But Trump brings them on board. They're the prize. And what we see is that they're compromised. When the deep state, when the secret society shows their teeth, these media groups kind of melt away. Those faithful to the true religion are put in a bind. Those who are lesser informed are being misled. We must never do evil so that a good can come of it. And make no mistake, taking vaccines tainted with the use of cells from murdered infants is pure evil. The way the cell lines are harvested is beyond ghoulish. You can look up an article in Crisis which described how those cell lines are harvested. It sounds occult itself, actually, to me. A culture who does this is no different than the ancient pagan cultures who practice infant sacrifice and other human sacrifices to their false gods. No different whatsoever. And shame on Pope Francis and Ratzinger. They both should have known better. Perhaps the allure of the one world government agenda is too powerful. Can the great apostasy get worse? When our Lord comes again, will he find faith on the earth?
As we kind of wind down here, I'm going to throw guys a couple grenades out there too. But these are things that have been on my heart and come across in my research. One of them is this, that it's possible that some of the trad conspiracies and narratives and stories about some of the more progressive figures in the church are exaggerated. Now, let me just hold on.
Trigger warning alert.
I'm not saying those figures are good. I'm not saying they didn't commit certain things that were gravely wrong. I'm not saying the rumors are all false. I'm just saying that there is a push from the right wing of the deep state to discredit these figures. Now, I'm not endorsing them or anything like that, but that's something I've come across. Like I said, with Taylor Marshall's infiltration, I've written critically of it. At least in there, he tries to kind of sift fact from fiction. Two, when you step away from this world, which I kind of have, you see it, a lot of it for what it is. I would recommend reading Christian Perfection and Contemplation by Father Gary Lagrange, who's very much right-wing himself. The section on charity there as the animating principle of all human life, and go on to Tradcath Twitter and read that section from Father Gary Lagrange. I forget what part it is, but see if you can find it there. Like websites. It's I'm sorry, and I'm not doing this in a judgmental way, but it's going to be hard to find it there. Journalism itself tends to breed neurosis, narcissism, especially social media, where someone has a couple drinks and they get on Twitter and they start talking about this and that. It's humiliating. It does no good in recruiting people into the church. The third point I would say is, people kind of give in to despair or whatever, but I would say a couple things. One is, this, in the past, it was the same thing. The King of France, the King of Spain, the King of, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of England, this podesta of, Milan versus that of Florence, the Medicis. I mean, it's just the way it is, that political bodies attempt to utilize the church. The thing is different about today is we can read about it every day, every second, every hour. Right. So we'd be living our lives. We might even know who the Pope was. And so we just go about our daily life practicing the faith, and that's what you should do. There are people who are called for more peaceful, just, and fair political action. And as bad as the Capitol siege was, in the end, what it showed was how weak the system is. That I'm not saying do that stuff or whatever, and I'm not incriminating people or anything like that, but the point is that the system is very brittle. We have a totalitarian technocratic state coming online. It's already online. It's just a matter of time, literally time. It takes time to organize things before they really start, coming after us. They already are, and they will continue to do so. But all is not lost. And then third, our Lord Jesus Christ is himself Lord of history, and he uses us to, accomplish his will. But this, his providence guides everything, right? And it doesn't do any good to be like up on a QAnon forum or something like that, reading about how someone was telling me that the Q is saying that Trump is still the president of the United States, but Joe Biden is the president of Washington, D.C., and then the Kraken's going to come out in March, and Trump's going to declare martial law. There may be some sort of insurrection planned by the right wing of the deep state. I don't know, but I think that all that stuff does no good. Reading all that does no good for anyone, and that we are called to fulfill our daily duties. I'm not trying to be a spiritual director or something like that, and to avoid mortal sin, venial sin, and then imperfections, and that most people are called to do that. And you realize that people, this is something I was thinking about today, there's like videos on the internet where people are exploiting like exorcism in a sense of like this tremendous suffering people undergo, and someone's like, oh, we can get like 200,000 views, and we're going to talk about exorcism today. Now, obviously, some of those videos may be beneficial, I'm not sure, but this is people like using religion as profit, or for profit. And I remember going to Medjugorje when I was younger. I don't think Medjugorje is illicit apparition as far as I can tell, but I remember going there and just like stalls and stalls and stalls of religious items being sold. And even when I was in high school, I was younger, I realized, there's something off here. So that's a lot of what's going on in YouTube, is they sit down and they're planning this stuff out. The final thing I'll say in regard to that is, even though I just said what I said, I don't think, as far as I can tell, there's probably no one in trad media who's totally fake. I think most of them they think what they're doing is good. You just get involved in this business and people get corrupted by money. I mean, do you want $200,000 or do you want $30,000 a year? Which one do you want, right? Yeah. You want someone sending you $20,000 a month on Patreon or $3? Which one? And so people make a choice. They make little compromises here and there. I'm not judging their heart.
And we live in an unjust economy where it's very difficult for a man to raise his family on a single wage.
Yeah, and I don't think the option is the Benedict option necessarily. I think that reading the Benedict option as building from the ground up in the Confucian sense is to a certain degree true. Obviously, like before you go out and like run for president, you should run for your local city council or something like that. And there are things, this is what the left did, how they won the election, is they got the people in position at these different voting booths and polling stations, and some of the stuff I saw with my own eyes, and they got those people in there, and that's how we're going to win. So I think that building from the ground up via the Benedict option is good. I think the important thing is not to give in to fear, and not to, I've been on many conspiracy podcasts and things and interviewed different conspiracy people, but you can get lost in that world. I mean, the left is not wrong in saying that. Like, I think a lot of people, especially if you have a tendency toward mental health issues, don't start, like reading about Merovingian bloodlines or whatever on the internet, because you might wake up one day, and I've seen this happen to people, lost.
Yeah. One final point I wanted to raise and ask your thoughts on, Dr. Russell, was that previously we had discussed Dr. Pliny's kind of hermeneutic of history with the 5 revolutions, and how the 5th revolution is the mystical, occult revolution that occurs. Well, the 4th revolution of tribalism and chaos and anarchy sort of overlaps with the 5th revolution, and that seems to be one way of seeing the time that we're living in at the moment. But have you noticed that politics is becoming more openly mystical? I've picked up on. We've seen that, I've mentioned before, that these QAnon posts and everything does almost seem like literal hypnotization. And
oh yeah, the way Steve Bannon looks at you,
yeah,
the thing, it's really weird. It's like cult stuff. I'm sorry, it is.
Yeah, I'm not just punching on the right here. The left, the derangement is off the charts. I saw something about how this article saying that black trans women are literally divine, or like are gods, and this kind of mysticism is now sort of percolating into discourse across the spectrum. We don't live in modernity with the exaltation of reason. We're in post-modernity, and the return of, well, the distrust, the rejection of all claims on truth, all meta-narratives.
I'm going to have to correct you. We live in the post-ironic age, because post-modernity has already deconstructed modernity, and this post-ironic age is the age of, like, trans women are goddesses. End of story. And if we're like, well, I don't know if they are goddesses, right? So that is the age we live in. So post-modernity has already, the deconstruction has happened.
I would disagree with that.
Now we're going to build back better.
I don't know if it's complete, if that deconstruction has completely occurred. You talk to a lot of boomer generation onwards, particularly those that they still believe in the kind of essential sort of trustworthiness of institutions and the system, and they do see things in I would say a kind of rationalist way, and they do still believe in universals like democracy and human rights and liberalism and a free press and so on. So I'd say they are still holdouts of modernity. So I don't think it's completely deconstructed.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't being silly, but I was being, somewhat that serious. I think that's what they're building it. But I think the important point that I was trying to make tonight is that the right is part of this, just as much as the neocons are. I mean, if somebody gets out there, if you get up into all efforts to get into the mainstream by sincerely faithful Catholics are either crushed or compromised. I mean, you look at a network like EWTN or something like that, there is good stuff on there, but from what I know, there was always problems at EWTN, even before more recent, like Trumpian stuff or whatever. And what media is psychological warfare. Just like, Virgil's Aeneid is meant to create patriotic Romans, even though it's like an ironic voice in Virgil or whatever that's critical of that, but like that was the point of that. Mm-hmm. And like the newspaper was meant to support the nation state. I mean, there was some criticism or whatever, but that's all gone. So mainstream media and even mainstream alternative media, I mean, you think that people sitting around, very intelligent, wealthy people are like, okay, we have all these alternative media, this conspiracy culture. You don't think they would want to seize that. Right? They would seize control, and they use money. If not, they'll just run someone off the road. I don't think anymore they have to kill people. And their journalists have been killed, like in the 90s and stuff like that. But I don't think they have to do that anymore. I think there's just so much compromise and corruption. And, like a lot of these trad figures, too, that I think they don't know what they're talking about. A lot of I'm not saying I do. I'm not an expert. I'm not a theologian. But that's a tweet I read today was, a lot of these people they just don't know. And they kind of make it up as they go along, or they go back and forth on different points.
And the power structure knows that people are immersed more and more in this kind of media, and that there is the ever-growing distance between what they find online and what's transmitted on the legacy systems. And I think that is a kind of, that gulf is almost like a derangement device. I've mentioned before a famous kind of quote from Theodore Dalrymple about how communist propaganda is not designed to instruct or convince, but to humiliate. That is the nature of so much of this madness. I think it's epistemological terrorism. It is designed to just derange you so that you're just left this kind of gibbering wreck. But I would like to just make some final points for my part, and that is that when you see trad media friendly to some part of the regime, someone interviewing Bannon or Jack Posobiec, then you can be sure there will be some kind of compromise. Who knows, you'll soon maybe be hearing about Judeo-Christian civilization rather than Catholic civilization. So be careful of outlets that sort of interact with the system. Also, this sort of minor point, but I think the style, for want of a better word, of trad figures is something to watch out for. There's a figure out there whose logo is a skull with a hoodie and headphones and has these Americanist skateboards. That to me just I would take with a pinch of salt. If you look at this survey, Marshall, Vigano, this borderline idolatry of Trump was always going to end in tears. We know from Holy Scripture, put not your trust in princes, but in the name of the Lord. And let's remember that for the devil, traditional Catholics, faithful Catholics, are the prize. The unconverted world is already under his dominion. And he's far higher intelligence than us, and he's going to know how to manipulate to win that prize.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as my final words, I'll say this, that, I am someone very much attracted to monarchy, to medievalism, to all that stuff. But, you have to understand that there is another movement. I mean, the 180 IQ historical narrative is that this is something that's been there for a long time in the West. I don't believe necessarily in the Merovingian conspiracies and stuff like that, but that these movements and, occultic right-wing movements have been there not just since the 19th century, but before that. And that just because someone's a duke or a count or whatever, it doesn't mean that they're a saint or Catholic, right? Like that's true, and I would say tangent to that, like you will see once and I've been down these different roads myself in different, worlds of Traditionalism and the right, that you will start coming across, occultic symbols. The Falun Gong has swastikas, that's the Indo-European symbol of, the sun or whatever, but these different like Templar this or that groups or whatever, like I'm not saying that that's Templar, or at least originally we're bad or something like that originally, but that you run across things and ideas and people and symbols and music and philosophical theories that are explicitly satanic. They shouldn't get a pass because they're like on the right.
Right. Another final point I'd raise is that all of this story episode, from my point of view, is another sad story of Americanism. The desperation to see the United States as, to use one of their books, a Catholic republic. And if we just vote hard enough, we can turn America into the Christian country that it once was. And there is still the attachment to Americanism, which read Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Testem Benevolentiae, where he describes Americanism as its negligence of the contemplative virtues and an overemphasis on the active virtues. And you can sense certain currents, shall we say.
This is the absolute last comment I'll make, but you're doing a Jericho march for someone who is pro-choice in certain cases, if I'm correct. Someone who is pro-gay marriage, someone who has appeared in pornographic videos, not acting in the act, but like during these interludes or something. That's where that foul comment Trump has, I believe, was from. Someone who whose regime has brought about the Biden administration, the destruction of American democracy. Now, again, I'm not Americanist, but like we no longer have even the pretense of just voting anymore, and this was all justified. So this is not to endorse the neocons, and those who criticize Trump as never Trumpers. Those were people in 2016 who were neocons who said don't vote for President Trump because he's too hard-edged. We're not even criticizing him for being, too conservative or something like that. I think he was an actor that was propped up. Like I listened to Bannon's Frontline PBS interviews where he kind of hints at that at certain points, that they brought him in, and he's a reality TV show actor, and they bring him in, and he's exactly what was needed then. People were mad about immigration and identity in 2016. They saw this whole trad movement going on. They could use that. So religion can be used to manipulate people, and it very often is. I'm not saying that therefore you should be this libertarian skeptic or something. No, you should be a traditional Catholic or a faithful Catholic. But just know that in that milieu, there are people who manipulate through media.
Well, that's a great point to end on. Dr. Jesse Russell, it's been a fascinating interview, and thank you so much for your time, your scholarship, your research, analysis.